The cave smelled of damp limestone, kerosene smoke, and fear. In the darkness beneath southern Okinawa, on April 20th, 1945, 12-year-old Masako pressed her face against her mother's chest and listened to the sounds that would decide whether she lived or died. Artillery thumped in the distance, boots scraped on coral gravel outside the cave mouth, and somewhere in the blackness behind her, a Japanese army officer whispered the order every civilian on the island had been taught to obey. "It is time to show loyalty to the emperor." Her mother's hand tightened around a kitchen knife. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything Masako had been told about the war, about her enemies, and about which side wanted her to survive, because the soldiers calling into that cave in broken Japanese weren't there to kill her. They were there to stop her from dying at the hands of her own military. This is the story of how thousands of Okinawan civilians discovered that the demons they'd been ordered to die rather than face were the only people fighting to keep them alive. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you find this story as remarkable as we do, hit that like button and subscribe. History like this deserves to be remembered. The mathematics of Operation Iceberg were brutal from the start. On April 1st, 1945, 183,000 American troops landed on Okinawa's western beaches in what would become an 82-day campaign the Marines called the Typhoon of Steel. The island's strategic value was obvious. Okinawa sat just 350 miles from mainland Japan, close enough to launch the final invasion of the home islands. What American planners didn't fully anticipate was that they weren't just fighting the 100,000 Japanese troops dug into the island's cave networks and concrete fortifications. They were fighting an ideology that demanded every man, woman, and child choose death over surrender. By spring 1945, Imperial Army doctrine had calcified into a doctrine of absolute refusal. No surrender wasn't just military policy, it was a moral imperative hammered into soldiers and civilians alike through propaganda, school curricula, and direct orders from local commanders. Village chiefs, many under pressure from Japanese officers, organized group suicides in hamlets across Okinawa's smaller islands. On Tokashiki, Zamami, and Ai, entire communities were marched into the mountains or ordered into caves with instructions that left no room for interpretation. Purify yourself through death or be defiled by the enemy. The propaganda machine had been running at full throttle for months. Leaflets distributed to schools depicted American soldiers as beasts who would rape women and mutilate children. Teachers told students that capture meant torture. Japanese officers explicitly used the word defiled to describe what would happen to anyone taken alive by Allied forces. For civilians who had never traveled beyond their rice paddies, who got their information from military authorities and village radios, these warnings weren't abstract. They were gospel. The Americans would kill them. Everyone knew it, except it wasn't true. And the collision between that lie and reality would transform the Pacific War's final chapter into something more complex than simple combat, because while Japanese commanders were ordering civilians to commit suicide rather than face capture, American units were developing an entirely different protocol, one built around loudspeakers, Japanese language leaflets, and unarmed translators who walked into enemy caves and tried to talk people out of killing themselves. The sensory texture of those final weeks was a study in contrasts. Inside the caves where civilians hid, the air hung thick with smoke from kerosene lamps, the sourness of unwashed bodies pressed together, and the metallic tang of fierce sweat. Families crouched on damp earth, listening to artillery that shook limestone dust from the ceiling. Flies circled constantly. Human waste collected in corners. Prayers were whispered in darkness, punctuated by the distant thump of naval guns and the closer, sharper crack of rifle fire. In some caves, Japanese soldiers shared the same cramped breathing space with villagers, their presence a constant reminder of the orders civilians had received: resist or die. Above ground, the landscape told a different story. American medics moved through shattered villages where roof tiles and splintered bamboo littered streets turned into rubble canyons. The smell of cordite mixed with burnt thatch and sea salt. In temporary refugee compounds just behind the front lines, U.S. psychological operations teams distributed leaflets printed in careful Japanese script. Anata tachi wa hitori mo korosaremasen. You will not be killed. Field translators mounted loudspeakers on jeeps and called the same message into cave mouths, their voices competing with artillery and the desperate crying of children hidden inside. The disconnect was absolute. Japanese officers told civilians that Americans were devils. American translators stood outside caves and promised food, medical treatment, and protection under rules similar to the Geneva Convention. One side demanded death as proof of loyalty. The other offered chocolate bars and bandages. Guess which message most Okinawans had been conditioned to believe? The answer to that question would be written in the casualty statistics that emerged after the campaign ended in late June. The island's death toll reached roughly 242,000 people, and approximately 149,000 of those names, etched into Okinawa's cornerstone of peace memorial, belong to civilians. Not soldiers, not combatants, ordinary people caught between artillery, bombardments and orders from their own government to die rather than surrender. Protection came from the most unlikely source. But here's what makes this story worth examining in detail. Among those tens of thousands of civilian deaths were thousands of survivors, people who lived because American soldiers refused to let Japanese propaganda win. Men like Teruto Tsubota, a Nisei interpreter with the 6th Marine Division, who walked into caves unarmed and stripped to the waist to prove he carried no weapon. Women who clutched kitchen knives and cyanide capsules in the darkness, fully prepared to kill their children rather than see them captured, only to have American medics gently take those weapons away and hand them sea rations instead. The question that haunted both sides was simple. How do you save people who have been ordered to kill themselves to avoid you? The answer would emerge cave by cave, family by family, in encounters that felt less like military operations and more like desperate interventions, moments where the boundary between enemy and protector dissolved entirely, leaving only the raw human mathematics of life and death. And it began with a pattern that repeated across the island, a sequence of events so consistent that it appears in dozens of survivor testimonies and American after-action reports: darkness, fear, a voice calling in Japanese from outside the cave, disbelief, and then the moment when civilians stepped into daylight expecting execution, and found medics waiting with water and bandages instead. That moment, that precise second, when propaganda shattered against reality, would reshape not just individual lives, but the entire post-war relationship between Okinawa and the United States. Because you can't easily hate people who saved your children's lives when your own government had ordered you to kill them. But first, those children had to be convinced to come out of the caves, and that required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with trust. Teruto Tsubota stood at the mouth of a cave near Shuri Castle on May 3, 1945, and did something that would have earned him a court-martial in the Japanese army. He took off his shirt. The Marine Corps interpreter unbuckled his belt, removed his uniform jacket, then his undershirt, until he stood bare-chested in the afternoon heat with his hands raised above his head. Inside the cave, 47 Okinawan civilians watched this strange performance through the dim light filtering past rubble and smoke. They had knives, they had poison, and they had orders. Tsubota called into the darkness in the Okinawan dialect most Marines couldn't pronounce. "I am unarmed. I am Japanese like you. The Americans will not hurt you." The silence that followed contained every assumption about the war that was about to break. This wasn't combat. This was something the military manuals didn't cover: the desperate psychology of convincing people that survival was possible when everything they'd been taught said it wasn't. And it was happening in hundreds of locations across southern Okinawa as American units pushed deeper into the island's cave-riddled interior. The pattern repeated with variations: translators calling in Japanese, civilians refusing to believe, and then the moment when propaganda collided with a reality so different, it short-circuited everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The Nisei translators were uniquely positioned for this work. Second-generation Japanese Americans who spoke the language fluently and understood the cultural context of shame, loyalty, and imperial duty. Men like Tsubota had grown up between two worlds. American citizens with Japanese faces now asking their grandparents' countrymen to trust the very nation that had just spent 3 years bombing their island. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it worked, because when Tsubota stripped to show he carried no weapon, when he stepped into that cave entrance alone, while his Marine escort waited outside with rifles lowered, he became something the propaganda couldn't account for: proof that the narrative was a lie. One man, no weapon, walking into darkness. The woman who emerged first clutched a 6-month-old infant, wrapped in a torn kimono. Her clothing was patched cotton, stained with ash and cave mud. Her feet were bare and bleeding. She had expected to die, had been prepared to smother her child rather than let American soldiers touch him, and now she stood blinking in sunlight, while a Japanese-American translator handed her a canteen and a chocolate bar. The cognitive dissonance was so complete she couldn't speak. She just stood there shaking while Tsubota called back into the cave for the others. 46 more civilians followed her out over the next 30 minutes, elderly grandparents who walked with canes fashioned from bamboo, children with distended bellies from malnutrition, their kimono sleeves black with soot, teenage girls whose mothers had given them poison capsules wrapped in cloth, Instructions to swallow them if soldiers came. Every person who stepped into daylight carried the same expression, confusion bordering on shock, because the Marines waiting outside weren't pointing rifles at them. They were pointing to a field kitchen where Navy corpsmen had set up a triage station with blankets, water, and medical supplies. This scene, this exact sequence of events, repeated across the island with such consistency that it appears in after-action reports from dozens of different American units. The variables changed, different caves, different translators, different marine divisions, but the core elements remained constant. Japanese language pleas from outside, civilians convinced they would be killed, and then the shattering moment when they discovered that the people trying to save them were the ones they'd been told to fear most. The sensory shock was as important as the psychological one. Civilians who emerged from caves smelling of kerosene smoke and human waste were immediately doused with DDT powder, a necessity for disease control that felt like a violation until they realized the Americans were also bandaging wounds and checking children for malaria. Medics moved through refugee groups with tin cups of water, enamel plates of canned beef, and morphine for the seriously injured. The texture of those first encounters is preserved in dozens of oral histories. The metallic taste of American canteen water, the unfamiliar sweetness of canned peaches, the strange sensation of having wounds cleaned with iodine and dressed with gauze torn from medical kits instead of old kimono cloth. In one documented case near Kakazu Ridge, a Navy corpsman named James Hartley spent 40 minutes treating a 12-year-old girl whose leg had been shredded by shrapnel from American artillery. He used the same morphine, the same sulfur powder, the same careful stitching he would have used on a wounded Marine. The girl's grandmother watched the entire procedure in silence, then asked through a translator why the American wasn't killing them. Hartley, according to his diary entry from May 9th, didn't know what to say to that, so I just gave the kid my chocolate ration and told her she'd be okay. They expected monsters. They got medics with chocolate bars. But not everyone was convinced by demonstrations of mercy. The Japanese military's psychological grip on civilian populations was deep and multi-layered. Officers who had spent months drilling villagers on loyalty to the emperor didn't simply abandon that control when American troops arrived. In several documented incidents, Japanese soldiers hiding in caves with civilians actively prevented surrender, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through direct violence. Reuters' investigations after the war uncovered testimony from survivors who watched Japanese officers execute village elders who argued for surrender. The threat was explicit: if you try to leave, if you try to trust the Americans, you will be killed by your own soldiers first. This created impossible situations where American translators called into caves knowing that some of the people inside wanted to come out but couldn't because they were being held at gunpoint by their own military. The only solution was patience. Wait for the Japanese soldiers to retreat deeper into the cave system, or wait until hunger and thirst made survival more important than ideology. In dozens of cases, families escaped at night after Japanese troops moved to different positions, crawling out of caves in darkness and stumbling toward American lines with white cloth tied to sticks, hoping the sentries would recognize surrender before they started shooting. The makeshift refugee camps that sprang up behind American lines became another site of transformation. Temporary compounds where civilians slept on straw mats in buildings that still smelled of burnt wood and cordite. U.S. military police and Japanese language interpreters sorted families, compiled census lists, and tried to reunite children separated from parents. The camps weren't comfortable. They were overcrowded, undersupplied, and chaotic. But they were also something civilians hadn't experienced in months, places where the military fed them instead of requisitioning their food, where medics treated their illnesses instead of conscripting their labor, where children received blankets instead of orders to die. The contrast with Japanese military governance was so stark it appears repeatedly in post-war testimonies. Under Japanese control, village rice granaries had been seized for army rations, leaving civilians to survive on sweet potato and millet. By spring 1945, many Okinawans were scavenging roots from bombed-out fields and boiling tree bark for sustenance. Their children's bellies were hollow, their clothing was patched beyond recognition, and their feet were calloused black from walking barefoot through ash and mud. Then they arrived at American refugee camps and found sea rations, canned meat, white bread, and sugar, quantities of food they hadn't seen since before the war started. One survivor's testimony captures the emotional core of this reversal. "We were told the Americans would kill us. Instead, they wrapped our children in blankets." That single sentence, documented by PBS researchers interviewing Okinawan civilians decades after the battle, encapsulates the psychological shock that thousands experienced. The enemy wasn't supposed to care whether your child was cold. The demons weren't supposed to share their rations. The barbarians weren't supposed to use their medical supplies on people who weren't even their own citizens. Propaganda promised death, America delivered canned peaches, but the most devastating challenge to Japanese propaganda came from something even more fundamental than food or medicine: the simple fact that American soldiers treated Okinawan civilians as human beings worth saving. When a Marine broke his own chocolate ration in half to give to a starving child, when a Navy medic used morphine on an elderly woman hit by shrapnel, when translators spent hours coaxing terrified families out of caves instead of simply sealing the entrances, these weren't strategic decisions. They were ethical ones, and they were being made by soldiers who had just spent weeks fighting one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific War, who had watched their friends die in caves and on ridges, who had every reason to view Okinawan civilians with suspicion or hostility. Instead, they chose mercy, and that choice would echo through the decades that followed, shaping Okinawa's relationship with America in ways no one could have predicted in the spring of 1945. But before we examine those long-term consequences, we need to understand what was happening simultaneously in other parts of the island, places where American troops didn't arrive in time, where the propaganda won, and where the orders to die were carried out exactly as Japanese commanders intended. Because not every cave had a translator standing outside calling for surrender, the cliffs at the northern tip of Saipan are still called Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, names that don't soften with time or distance. On July 9, 1944, 10 months before the Okinawa landings, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from those limestone precipices, clutching their children to their chests, choosing a 100-foot fall onto coral rock over capture by American forces advancing across the island. U.S. Marines watching from below could only stand helpless as families leaped, their screams swallowed by wind and surf. Stretcher-bearers collected the survivors they could reach, pulling broken bodies from tide pools, discovering that many had been lied to so completely they believed falling to their deaths was mercy compared to what awaited them at American hands. The tragedy at Saipan became the template for what Japanese military authorities would attempt, and in too many cases succeed, in orchestrating across Okinawa 9 months later. Because for every cave where Teruto Tsubota convinced families to surrender, for every refugee camp where civilians received chocolate and bandages, there were villages where the propaganda won completely, places where Japanese officers' orders were carried out before American translators could arrive, communities where the choice between ideology and survival was decided by men with rank insignia and drawn swords, where village chiefs under military pressure organized what the Japanese euphemistically called group suicides, forced marches into mountains, orders to assemble in caves with grenades, commands to drink poison rather than face the shame of capture. The small islands surrounding Okinawa proper, Tokashiki, Zamami, Karama, Reto, became sites of mass civilian death in March 1945. Weeks before the main American landings, Japanese military authorities, anticipating the invasion, ordered villages to purify themselves, a word that carried explicit meaning. Death was preferable to dishonor. On Tokashiki Island on March 28, approximately 330 civilians died in organized group killings after the island's garrison commander issued orders that left no room for interpretation. Survivors who testified after the war described village leaders distributing hand grenades and organizing families into groups. The orders came through official channels, backed by military authority, enforced by the threat that anyone refusing would be executed as a traitor. When your own government orders you to die, where do you turn? The answer for most Okinawan villagers was nowhere. They had no context for refusing military orders, no cultural framework for questioning, authority that came wrapped in imperial rhetoric and enforced by armed soldiers. The propaganda had done its work too well. Teachers had spent months telling children that Americans were demons. Leaflets showed crude drawings of Allied soldiers committing atrocities. Radio broadcasts emphasized that capture meant violation worse than death. And when Japanese officers arrived in villages with explicit orders to resist or die, most civilians had no reason to believe those orders were anything other than legitimate, tragic perhaps, but necessary for the sake of honor and loyalty to the emperor. The texture of those final hours in villages like Tokashiki and Zamami is preserved in survivor testimony that emerged decades later. Families gathering in clearings at night, children crying, grandparents reciting Buddhist sutras, while younger villagers distributed poison or assembled groups near cliff edges. The smell of kerosene from lanterns mixing with the salt air, the sound of distant naval bombardment providing a percussion to prayers and weeping, and underneath it all, the suffocating certainty that this was the only choice available, that the alternative to organized death was something worse, Reuters' investigations after the war uncovered evidence that in several cases Japanese officers murdered village elders who resisted these group suicide orders. The threat of violence against anyone questioning the policy was explicit and enforced. This wasn't simply propaganda creating panic, it was military coercion backed by the immediate threat of execution. Survivors testified that soldiers told them directly, "If you try to surrender to the Americans, we will kill you ourselves. If you refuse the order to die with honor, you will die as a traitor." The psychological mechanism at work was brutally simple. Remove all alternatives except the one the military wants, then present that choice as voluntary honor rather than forced compliance. Frame mass death as spiritual purification rather than military murder. Make civilians complicit in their own destruction by wrapping it in the language of loyalty and shame. This is what happens when propaganda becomes policy. But here's what makes the Okinawan civilian tragedy particularly devastating. It was preventable. The same military apparatus that could organize village group suicides could have organized evacuations. The same officers who distributed grenades and poison could have distributed white flags and instructions for surrender. The same authority figures who told civilians that death was honorable could have told them that survival was acceptable. American forces were already broadcasting surrender appeals, dropping leaflets, sending translators to frontline positions. The infrastructure for civilian survival existed, but it required Japanese military authorities to choose civilian welfare over ideological purity. They chose ideology, and tens of thousands of Okinawans died because of that choice. The aftermath of these organized deaths haunted American soldiers who discovered the sites days or weeks later. Patrol reports describe finding bodies in caves, families arranged in circles with poison containers nearby, villages where every building was empty except for the dead, cliff bases where the tide had carried bodies into rock crevices that became mass graves by default. The Marines and soldiers who witnessed these scenes understood immediately what had happened. Not combat casualties, not collateral damage from bombardment, but deliberate civilian deaths, orchestrated by Japanese military authority. Some medics and chaplains recorded their reactions in diaries that survive in military archives. One Navy corpsman's entry from late April 1945 noted simply, "Found another cave today, 73 dead, mostly women and children. No wounds from fighting. They were told we would torture them, so they killed themselves. We could have saved them." The emotional weight of that realization that American forces were simultaneously fighting Japanese soldiers while trying to prevent Japanese commanders from murdering their own civilians appears repeatedly in veterans' accounts. The long-term psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Okinawans who lived through the group suicide orders because they managed to escape, because a translator reached them in time, or because they found the courage to refuse the orders despite the risks. These people carried complex trauma that mixed grief, guilt, and anger. Grief for family members who died believing the propaganda, guilt for surviving when others didn't, and anger at the military authorities who had lied so completely and ordered deaths so unnecessarily. That anger would find expression in post-war Okinawan identity and politics, shaping the island's complicated relationship with both Japan and the United States. But in the immediate aftermath of the campaign, the priority was simply survival. Processing the reality that the demons they'd been told to fear had spent the battle trying to save them, while their own military had spent it trying to kill them. The cognitive dissonance was complete and permanent. In one particularly striking account preserved by PBS researchers, an elderly woman who survived described the moment American soldiers found her family's cave. "We had knives ready. My husband had poison. We were going to drink it when the Americans came. But then we heard Japanese words from outside. A Japanese man telling us in our dialect that we wouldn't be hurt. We thought it was a trick. But the voice kept calling, kept promising safety. My husband went to the cave entrance to look. He came back crying. He said, 'There are Americans outside. They have food and medicine. I don't understand.' None of us understood. Everything we'd been told was backwards. That reversal, that fundamental inversion of expectation and reality, defined the Okinawan civilian experience of the battle's final weeks. As American forces secured more territory and established more refugee camps, as Nisei translators reached more villages and convinced more families to surrender, the word spread through surviving civilian populations. The propaganda was a lie. The Americans were not there to kill them. The real threat to their survival was the military they'd been taught to trust absolutely. By June 1945, as the campaign entered its final bloody phase around the last Japanese defensive positions in the south, thousands of Okinawan civilians were living in American-administered camps, eating American rations, receiving American medical care, and coming to terms with the fact that their own government had been willing to sacrifice them rather than allow them to experience the reality of American occupation. The question haunting everyone was simple: what happens when you survive the war your leaders ordered you to die in? The answer would reshape Okinawa's identity for generations. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream, where you can find thousands of documentaries exploring everything from World War II history to modern geopolitics. Sign up using the link in the description to get a free trial and support the channel while diving deeper into the stories that shaped our world. Shimabukuro Yoshiko was 73 years old when she returned to Okinawa in 1995 for the 50th anniversary of the battle's end, carrying with her a faded photograph of a young Marine whose name she had never known. In the photo, a baby, herself, sat in the soldier's arms, wrapped in an olive drab blanket with the letter US stenciled in black. Her mother had kept that photograph for 5 decades, hidden during the difficult post-war years, then displayed prominently once speaking about American soldiers became acceptable. Yoshiko had come back to the island to find the man who had saved her life, or at minimum, to understand why a combat soldier fighting the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific had stopped to wrap an enemy infant in his own blanket. She wasn't alone. Hundreds of Okinawans returned that anniversary year, carrying similar stories, similar photographs, similar questions about the moment their understanding of the world inverted completely. The long-term consequences of the Okinawan civilian experience during the spring of 1945 rippled outward in ways that military planners never anticipated and historians are still documenting. Because what happened on Okinawa wasn't just a military campaign that happened to involve civilians, it was a mass psychological transformation that reshaped an entire population's understanding of authority, propaganda, and the nature of their supposed enemies. The cognitive reversal that began in caves and refugee camps in April and May became the foundation for a relationship between Okinawa and the United States that defied every prediction about how occupied populations should relate to occupying forces. The immediate post-war period was chaos. American military government teams processed over 100,000 displaced Okinawan civilians through census stations, compiled family registries, organized food distribution networks, and tried to rebuild basic infrastructure on an island where 90% of buildings had been destroyed. The occupation wasn't gentle. It was military administration with all the inefficiencies and cultural misunderstandings that implies, but it was also fundamentally different from what civilians had been told to expect. Instead of mass executions and systematic rape, they got bureaucracy, ration cards, and medical clinics. Instead of slavery and torture, they got work programs that paid in military scrip and food supplements for malnourished children. The gap between propaganda and reality created a vacuum that Japanese authorities had no way to fill. How do you maintain ideological control over a population that has directly experienced the opposite of everything you told them? How do you preserve faith in imperial rhetoric when your own military ordered civilians to die while the enemy military worked to keep them alive? The answer, it turned out, was that you couldn't. The propaganda apparatus that had controlled Okinawan civilian thought for years shattered completely in the face of lived experience. Survival rewrites belief faster than any lecture. But the transformation wasn't simple or uniform. Many Okinawans struggled with complex, contradictory emotions about their experiences. Relief at surviving mixed with grief for those who hadn't. Gratitude toward individual Americans who had shown kindness mixed with anger at the military occupation that followed. And underneath everything ran a current of profound betrayal. The recognition that their own government had been willing to sacrifice them for an ideology that placed abstract honor above human life. This sense of betrayal found expression in the memorial culture that emerged in the decades after the war. The Cornerstone of Peace, dedicated in 1995 on the 50th anniversary, lists approximately 242,000 names: Japanese, American, Okinawan, Korean, British, Taiwanese, everyone who died in the battle, regardless of nationality. The memorial's design deliberately rejects militaristic triumphalism in favor of universal remembrance. Okinawan survivors who advocated for its construction wanted a monument that honored civilian deaths without glorifying the military orders that caused so many of them. They wanted to remember the Americans who saved lives alongside the Okinawans who died because no Americans arrived in time. Some survivors went further, maintaining personal relationships with the soldiers who had rescued them. Letters crossed the Pacific for decades, Okinawan families writing to thank Nisei translators who had convinced them to leave caves, Marines receiving holiday cards from children they'd given chocolate to during the battle, medics corresponding with civilians whose wounds they'd dressed in field hospitals. These weren't official programs or government initiatives. They were organic connections between people who had shared extraordinary moments when the boundary between enemy and protector dissolved completely. Teruto Tsubota, the interpreter who stripped to the waist outside caves to prove he was unarmed, received letters from Okinawan survivors for more than 40 years after the war. In a 1987 interview preserved in the Honolulu Star Bulletin archives, he described opening an envelope to find a photograph of a middle-aged woman with her grandchildren and a note that read, "You are the reason these children exist. You convinced my mother not to drink the poison. Thank you for our lives." Tsubota kept hundreds of such letters, each one a testament to the individual human decisions that accumulated into historical transformation. The broader implications of the Okinawan experience extend beyond the specific history of one island in one campaign. Because what happened on Okinawa was fundamentally a lesson about the power and fragility of propaganda, how completely it can control populations when reality is carefully managed, and how quickly it collapses when direct experience contradicts the narrative. Japanese military authorities had spent years building an ideological framework that positioned death as preferable to capture. They had the institutional authority, the cultural leverage, and the military enforcement to make that framework operational. They convinced thousands of civilians to prepare for suicide rather than face an enemy they'd never met. And then the enemy arrived offering food instead of torture, medics instead of executioners, blankets instead of brutality. Reality is the best propaganda. The American military's approach to Okinawan civilians wasn't motivated by propaganda objectives. It was motivated by basic military necessity and humanitarian instinct. Translators convinced people to surrender because living civilians provided intelligence and reduced the chaotic violence of combat operations. Medics treated civilian wounded because that was their job and their training. Individual soldiers shared rations because watching children starve felt wrong regardless of nationality. These weren't strategic decisions designed to win hearts and minds. They were tactical and ethical choices made by people trying to fight a war while minimizing unnecessary death. But the cumulative effect of those choices became the most effective counter-propaganda campaign in modern history. Every family that survived because a translator convinced them to leave a cave became living evidence that the propaganda was false. Every child who received medical treatment became proof that the enemy could show mercy. Every civilian who ate American rations, while their own military had requisitioned their rice, became a witness to the inversion of everything they'd been taught. The post-war reconstruction of Okinawa was complicated, often painful, and marked by continued tensions over American military presence that persist into the present. The island became a staging ground for the Korean War, a permanent base complex that Okinawans had little say in establishing, a symbol of Japan's complicated relationship with American power. Those tensions are real and legitimate. But running alongside that political complexity is a parallel narrative, the memory of individual Americans who chose humanity over hatred in the spring of 1945, and the Okinawan civilians whose survival depended on that choice. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the battle, the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum opened an exhibition featuring oral histories from survivors. Among the testimonies was an account from an elderly man who had been 7 years old during the battle. He described hiding in a cave with his grandmother while Japanese soldiers prepared to distribute grenades for a final honorable suicide. Then a voice called from outside in Okinawan dialect, telling them the Americans would not harm them. His grandmother refused to believe it, but the voice kept calling, patient and persistent, until curiosity overcame fear and his grandmother crawled to the cave entrance to look. She came back crying, the testimony reads. She said there was a Japanese man outside wearing an American uniform and American soldiers behind him with their guns pointed at the ground, not at us. She said they had food. She said we should go out. The Japanese soldiers in the cave told her she would be defiled, that we would all be killed. But she had seen their faces. She said they looked like they wanted us to live. So we went out, and they gave us rice, and they wrapped me in a blanket, and I realized everything I'd been taught was backwards. That realization echoed through 3 generations. The story of Okinawan civilians in the spring of 1945 is ultimately a story about the collision between ideology and reality, about what happens when propaganda meets direct experience, about the human capacity to change fundamental beliefs when survival depends on it. It's about the Japanese military authorities who chose ideology over civilian welfare, issuing orders that killed tens of thousands of their own people. And it's about the American soldiers, sailors, and Marines who chose mercy when hatred would have been easier, who saw enemy civilians as human beings worth saving, even in the middle of the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. Shimabukuro Yoshiko never found the Marine whose photograph she carried. Too many years had passed, too many records were incomplete, too many soldiers who served on Okinawa had died in the decades since. But at the anniversary ceremony in 1995, she placed the photograph at the base of the cornerstone of peace, alongside flowers and incense. In the memorial's design, American and Okinawan names are listed side by side, former enemies united in remembrance. A stranger approached her as she knelt there, an elderly American veteran with tears in his eyes who had been watching from a distance. He didn't know if he was the Marine in her photograph, but he had been there in 1945. He had pulled civilians from caves. He had given children chocolate. He had watched families emerge into daylight, expecting execution and finding medics instead. "I'm sorry we couldn't save more," he said through a translator. Shimabukuro Yoshiko looked at him for a long moment, then bowed deeply. "You saved the ones you could," she replied. "That is what we remember. And that is what the world should remember too."